The United States is in a declining position in the world economy. It has been, but now it's being felt. You could pretend it wasn't there. You could deny it. There are plenty of people who do that still. But it's getting harder and harder as these tariffs and sanctions all show. That's the most important thing to understand. Every country in the world, and I want to underline every, is rethinking its entire foreign economic policy and your political alliances. Look at the departure of Americans from Niger in Africa and being replaced by Russian troops. These are all signs. You'd have to be really blind or desperate not to see all that's going on.
Today, if you tell a person that USA is declining and BRICS, inclusive of Africa, starting to rise, I believe that they will not agree with you, or they'll give you facts, say that USA is still it's still a superpower, and what you're saying is a lie. Well, I want you to listen to this story where this white economist professor shares the idea that USA is falling, especially the West is falling, and BRICS is rising, and China being one of it. It shows a lot of potential in rising and taking away, the USA. Especially Africa is also envisioned as one of the continents which will be rising. So I want us to watch this video, and then I'll tell you what I think and what are the opportunities that diasporans can have, bearing that the USA is now falling. But what mostly is important is the fact that the truth is out there, that indeed this is happening. And for people who have been doubting for the longest time, they need to watch this video so that they can get the context. And because if you tell an African youth to stay in Africa, develop Africa, they won't agree with you unless you show them this video. So this video is going to act as a proof, because this is an economist, Richard Wolff, has shared this, and I believe that this information will disseminate to you. And if you're watching this video for the first time, you can consider joining my membership, subscribe to the channel. So I want to give you time to watch the video, and then let's interact at the end of the video. As you usually do, this is Eugene Stories, so let's jump right into it.
In which political urgency drives endless expansion of the debt. And let me try in a very simple but clear way to explain this. We have a bizarre kind of capitalism in the United States. And by bizarre, I mean it puts our politicians in a very strange and awkward position. On the one hand, corporations want the government to do lots of expensive things for them. They want them to maintain a global military, to protect buying and selling around the world, which the United States does as much or more than any other country on earth. And it wants to protect its ability to get materials, to get them for a good price, and having hundreds and hundreds of military bases around the world, which is very expensive, not to mention the wars, which are even more expensive, is part of the cost of servicing what corporations want. At the same time, those corporations resent and fight against paying taxes, which would be the way the government gets the revenue to then do what the corporations want the government to do. All right, let's take a look then, not at the corporations for a moment, but at the mass of working people. They too have things they want and need from the government to do. Everything from Social Security and Medicare to maintaining the roads, to helping finance schools, education, hospitals, and all the rest. And like the corporations, the mass of people don't want to spend the taxes to pay for all of that. So we have corporations and working people, both of whom put demands on the government to do things which cost the government money, and yet at the same time, The corporations and the mass of people don't want to pay taxes. Last point, the corporations have enormous wealth to get the government to do what they want, and the mass of people do not. That is, nobody has so far organized the mass of people to put together the amount of money that might someday enable them to influence the government. But right now, and for most of the history of capitalism, the division of the income in a society between corporations and the people, and between rich and the mass of people, puts the overwhelming bulk of the wealth in the hands of corporations and the rich. And now, what everybody knows who's honest, the corporations and the rich have been very successful in removing the burden of taxation off of themselves and onto the mass of people. This has been going on for the last century. And now, here comes the point. After a certain level, the mass of people revolt. They say we will not pay more taxes. They make it impossible for politicians to keep doing what they've been doing, which is shifting the burden. For example, in case people are not familiar, we used to rely on the income tax, which is a progressive tax. The higher your income, the higher the percentage you have to pay. Then, when corporations were strong enough, they got that changed. Half of what the government raises now is money off of Social Security, withholding from the weekly check of an American. That's not a progressive tax. That does not go up in percentage as you get richer. In fact, if you earn more than $160,000 a year, which rich people in this country do, you don't pay on what's above 160,000. Only the average people pay. So look at how successful corporations and the rich have been in shifting the taxes, but they can't anymore. The mass of people won't allow it. They vote out anybody who raises their taxes. Okay, now the politicians are in a jam. The corporations and the people demand services, but they can't squeeze more taxes out of the masses. And the corporations and the rich have basically bribed their way out of paying much in the way of taxes. So, what is the government going to do? What do the politicians do? Answer: they borrow money. The way they keep spending on the corporations and on the people is not by taxing, but by borrowing the money. And that's why the borrowing is getting bigger and bigger. And all the national debt is the accumulation of annual deficits over the years. And they're going crazy now because the government, desperate to hold on to political power, is spending money like there's no going out of style. The most impressive example, funding the war in Ukraine. Huge amounts of money simply spent out, funding the Israeli activity in Gaza, which we are also doing in the form of military supplies that are effectively given to the Israelis at little or no cost. So, wars, military expenditure, everything is being spent without the ability to make the beneficiaries of that spending pay for it in taxes, because it's impossible for the politicians to survive if they would dare do that. If you tax corporations and the rich, they will fund whoever runs against you in the next election. So you're gone. And for the mass of people, they are so stressed right now that if you tax them an inch more, you really will have a popular revolt. It's a sign that American capitalism is in a very bad place. We are not the great economy our political leaders would like us to believe, neither Republicans nor Democrats. We are in very serious trouble. And one measure of that is that this political absurdity of our politicians having to borrow more and more because they don't have the courage to tax means that we are in the situation you described. We are loaded up with debt in a way that we used to identify with countries that were in trouble economically around the world. Now we don't hear that so much because it applies to us in terms of the ratio of the debt to the national income. And make no mistake, the debt matters. People who are seeing this explosion are trying to calm the American people. Well, it's not so important. Most of the debt is a debt of the government, the Treasury, to the Federal Reserve, which is another part of the United States government. All of that is true, but it is not relevant. It's not relevant because, in the end, the government has to raise the money to pay the interest on this enormous debt. And that means more and more of the money you and I pay in taxes in the United States is not going to give us a useful service. It's going to pay off whoever lent money to the government. And here's the last step: the fundamental injustice of the national debt is often overlooked. Who lends money to the United States government? But the minute you understand this, you will see it's rich people and corporations, and to some extent, foreign corporations and foreign governments. The mass of people are not in a position, they don't have any extra money to lend to the government. So they don't. The mass of people pay the taxes that are used to pay the interest to corporations and the rich who are in a position to lend to the government. If you see that, here comes the punchline of punchlines. You will understand that when the politicians borrow money, they are doing an enormous service to corporations and the rich because they're basically saying to them, we will not tax you. Instead, you shall take the money that we could have taken from you in taxes, and instead, we will borrow it from you. And after a few years, we'll give it back to you. And during that time, we'll pay you interest on the money that we've borrowed from you. So for corporations, this is a no brainer. Of course, it's better to have the government borrow from you than to tax you as corporations and the rich. So that's why they tolerate it. And that's why the mass of people, even if they don't understand the economics, understand they're being ripped off. And the deficit is a mechanism for ripping off the mass of people who pay the cost of it, whereas the benefit goes to the corporations and the rich, who are the only ones to be able to lend to the government. One last point: foreign governments are also able to lend money to the United States government. And most of the people watching this program probably don't know that the two largest lenders to the United States government are Japan and the People's Republic of China, ranking one and two among foreign lenders. China has somewhere around $800 billion lent to the United States government. That is money that the Chinese lend to the United States government, which the United States government can and does use in part to fight a war in Ukraine where China is helping the Russians. If that sounds like a strange arrangement, welcome to modern capitalism. This might strike you as even stranger. With $800 billion of US debt, the United States has to tax all of us, which it does, to raise the money, which it then sends to Beijing in interest on all the debt that the Chinese own of the United States government, which means that part of the money China uses to build up its military is the money we American taxpayers deliver to them. It's the way capitalism has organized the world. And it's not the least of the absurd contradictions that this system is living with and imposing on all of us. Okay, let's talk about that. The first thing is to remember, very simply, that putting tariffs on a vast array of products um, is what we call protection. You are protecting the industries inside your country by hampering the competition they face from abroad. Now, let's take the most egregious example of these new tariffs that were implemented this last week against China by the United States. The most extreme example is the electric car and truck, where the tariff, which was already in place at 27.5%, was raised to 100%. Let me explain briefly what that means. Imagine an electric car or truck made in China. I should tell everyone that China is now the world's number one producer of electric cars and trucks. They have figured out over the last 10 years that people have been competing in various parts of the world to produce a profitable electric vehicle as the way our society is going to replace the horrible pollution of the gas powered automobile with an electric automobile. Put aside whether that is an adequate climate control response, it isn't, but let's deal just with the tariff question. Okay, the Chinese have done it. They've won that competition, hands down. They produce the highest quality at the lowest price. So the competition has happened. Lots of companies here in the United States have been working on producing electric vehicles and the batteries needed to power them, but the Chinese have won that. Their system, which you can think about, has been able to mobilize their scientific talent, their technology, their corporations, private and public, and they've won the competition. So, if the world were going to buy the best, cheapest electric vehicle, we would all be buying Chinese. Much of the world is doing that, including Europe, where the Chinese cars and trucks, you see them on the road, not a problem. But no American sees them. Why? Because the 27.5% tariff means that whatever the Chinese charge for their trucks, electric trucks and cars, you have to pay that price to the Chinese if you were an American, plus 27.5% going to Uncle Sam as the tariff. That prices the Chinese out of the American market. You're going to make this even worse because Americans know and have told our government that the Chinese continue to improve their technology so that they're going to be even cheaper and even better than the Americans, and others competing with them are likely to be for years into the future. That's how far ahead the Chinese have achieved. Okay, so we are now raising it to, if the car costs $20,000 that you're buying from China to pay to the Chinese, you'll have to add another 20,000 and pay 40,000 here in the United States because you have to pay 20 to US government in tariff on top of the 20 to China. This effectively protects everybody producing a car here in the United States. If it costs, and just for simple arithmetic, if it costs $35,000 in the United States to produce a roughly similar truck or car, well, then you can sell it at 35. You could sell it at 36, 37, 38, because it would always still be cheaper to buy that car than the 40,000 you'd have to pay for the Chinese. That's why it's called protection. And it is mostly occurring because the losers of the competition don't want to pay the price of having lost the competition. There's no nice way to say this. And nobody should be fooled when the losers of the competition insist that the winner cheated. Yeah, that's what they always say. It's never their fault. It's not they didn't develop the technology. They didn't develop the expertise in batteries. They didn't. No, 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 no. They did everything right. The other side is cheating. Secretary of the Treasury Yellen went to China and invented an entirely new economics. Excess capacity, she said. The Chinese produce huge factories. Of course they do. That's how they achieve their efficiency. It's called economies of scale. It's something we teach economics students in the first year. If you produce a lot of something, you can bring down the cost per unit of what you produce. So you always build in excess capacity. Competitive enterprises do it all the time. It's part of American economic history. She's just counting, Ms. Yellen is, on people not understanding these basics, and so finding this to be some sort of argument as if the Chinese have cheated. No, they didn't. They outdid you. Competition always has winners and losers. And I know that here in America, I'm born and raised here, we cannot imagine the United States losing ever anything. But we do. We lost the war in Vietnam. We lost the war in Afghanistan. We're in the process of losing it in Ukraine. But Americans need to believe that we're always winning. The tariffs are a sign that American dominance, which we got used to after World War II, from the second half of the 20th century, was the dominance of the United States. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, it left the United States in what political scientists like to call a unipolar moment. But that's over now. The United States isn't what it was, and the Chinese and their allies have become a powerful new competitor. And the United States is having a hard time adjusting, which I can understand. It's like the British. It took them a century to realize that the British Empire wasn't there anymore. And some of them still haven't understood it. The United States is at an earlier stage. The sanctions you see, the tariffs you see, that's a switch to protectionism by a society that has no confidence in its own company's ability to compete. We used to. That's when the US was the champion of free trade around the world. That's because we could win in those situations. We were the most technologically dynamic. We were the fastest growing, but we're not anymore. And we haven't been for a generation now. And it's beginning to impact us day by day. And nobody should be fooled by leaders who continue to sanction and to tariff as if we were free to do that without consequences. Here's the most important bottom line for Americans. If you raise the price of the tariff, if you raise the cost of imported goods, whether they are solar panels or semiconductor chips or electric vehicles or any of the other items, if you put a tariff on them, it means everything coming in from abroad costs much more, which allows the American competitors to charge more than they could have ever gotten away with if they had had to compete. And if everybody does that, you know what that contributes to? Inflation. We're supposed to be a nation worried about inflation. Tariffs are inflationary, and they always have been. And so the irony here is you're flailing around. This is mostly political posturing. Mr. Biden is worried about voters in Michigan, which is where a lot of automobiles that burn gas are produced. So he's going to say, I'm protecting your job. Look, the inflation is pricing people out of the supermarket, out of the department store across America. That means fewer jobs in supermarkets and fewer jobs in department stores. And those lost jobs are more in number than the ones you're protecting in the auto industry. So the honest statement here is this is mostly political posturing whose net effect on the economy is not going to be very significant one way or the other.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I uploaded a quick video the other day on this particular topic, just very high level video. And one of the questions that I received from a viewer was, well, why are you saying that tariffs are bad? Tariffs will allow our producers to produce more. But you just summed up the effect that these tariffs will have on consumers and businesses so well. And I think
Yeah.
what you just said answers that question just very directly.
Let Thank you, but let me amplify it a bit more. The price of electric vehicles here in the United States will either be the $40, to use my example, that we have to give to China, 20 to China for the car, 20 to Uncle Sam for the tariff, or we will have these artificially protected high prices for electric vehicles produced here. But now keep in mind, in the rest of the world, our competitors can buy the cars they need, the trucks they need at $20. They buy it from China, the best and the cheapest. So, what goes into producing goods and services in Europe or in Asia or Africa or Latin America are cheap cars and trucks, which will allow them to not raise their prices of final goods the way Americans will have to, because we're having to pay $40 for the same Chinese truck instead of 20, or an inflated price for our protected American producers, which means our prices will not be competitive with those of people producing in the part of the world where they can buy the cheap Chinese truck. That's going to hurt our exports. We are losing our export market, and that hurts employment in the United States. So it is simply not correct to say it's protecting jobs here. It's protecting some jobs here in the auto industry at the price of other jobs affected by the consequences of protecting the auto. That's the honest answer. And if a clever student raises his or her hand and says, well, which is larger, the protected auto jobs or all the other jobs? The answer is nobody knows, because that work depends on what's going to happen in the future. It depends on all the other things. But the simplistic notion the tariff was good for jobs, that's not true. And that is either said out of ignorance or more likely among the politicians. It's good for a headline. It pleases the people there. And we hope nobody does the little bit of extra thinking that you and I are doing in this conversation.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that a couple of days ago, the United States reportedly threatened to sanction any country that signs trade deals with Iran. So are we effectively, we've got China, we've got Russia, now Iran. Well, Iran has been sanctioned, but now they're saying, well, we'll sanction anyone who even dares to do any business with Iran. So, are we now effectively going after the BRICS bloc individually, not as a whole, but country by country?
Yes, the BRICS, for everybody who doesn't know, China and its allies. The world economy is now split in a way it hasn't been for 75 years. Sorry. The world is now split in a way it hasn't been for 75 years. For most of the last 75 years, the dominant economic bloc in the world was the United States and its allies. These days, this is called the G7: the United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Those seven countries were the dominant reality of the world economy. That is no longer true. There is now a second block of countries, namely China and its allies. They are called the BRICS because the first five that got together, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and a half dozen more that have joined since. To give you an idea, as of 2023, last year, the total GDP, the total output per year of goods and services in the G7 was around 29% of the total output of the world. If you look at the BRICS, their output, all of it, was about 33%. In other words, as a bloc, the BRICS are already a bigger economic unit than the G7. That is a momentous change. And it's a gap getting bigger with each passing year. They were roughly equal in 2020. They're already significantly far apart in 2023. It's going very fast. The United States is in a declining position in the world economy. It has been, but now it's being felt. You could pretend it wasn't there. You could deny it. There are plenty of people who do that still. But it's getting harder and harder as these tariffs and sanctions all show. That's the most important thing to understand. Every country in the world, and I want to underline every, is rethinking its entire foreign economic policy to take account of the fact that there are now two power blocks. If you need to improve your exports or your imports or get a loan or get investment, you don't just go to London or Paris or New York. You can now go to New Delhi or you can go to Beijing or you could, it's a whole new world. And your political alliances, look at the departure of Americans from Niger in Africa and being replaced by Russian troops. These are all signs. You'd have to be really blind or desperate not to see all that's going on. Look at the miscalculation in Ukraine. My God, the West thought it was fighting a war with an isolated Russia. Wrong. Russia could turn and did turn to China and India and Brazil and got enormous amounts of help, meaning that the West misunderstood, which is why the West has had to escalate the fight and is still losing as a result. I mean, this you're making colossal mistakes because you don't want to face how the world economy has changed and what that really means. Last point. There are many studies, many books, articles about sanctions, like the one you mentioned. If anybody trades with Iran, well, then, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is lovely. You know what this means? Very little. Countries that were trading with Iran will now make an arrangement. They will make an understanding with some third country. We're going to ship what we used to ship to Iran to you. You have a relationship with Iran that is different from ours. You are too important for the United States to bother with, so we'll work through you. It's a little extra cash to pay for the extra expenses, a little more record keeping, but sanctions are evaded. That is the history of sanctions. The more you put them down, the more the people you put them on figure out ways around it. It's a little bit like tax law in the United States. Every year, Congress rewrites the taxes, and every year, people who used to be in Congress are now private accountants, and they advise their rich clients how to get around the latest. And then the government adjusts the law, and the people who evade the law adjust the evasions. And this silliness is good for headlines, but doesn't change the basic situation. Russia did not stop doing in Ukraine what it's doing because you hit them with the mother of all sanctions. Iran didn't change its government. Last month, over the last month, Secretary of the Treasury Yellen and the Secretary of State Blinken went to China, urging them to change their system. The Chinese must look at them and say, over the last 25 years, we have grown our economy 2 to 3 times faster than yours year in and year out. That's why you're here visiting us. We are the greatest escape from poverty the world has ever seen. Over 1 billion people escaping poverty in a generation. It's unheard of. Nobody in their right mind would come here urging us to change a system that has worked this well. You can't. What are you doing? It's ridiculous. And you know, most of the world looks at it that way. Only here in the United States does it seem reasonable for the United States to go to China after 25 years of doing less well, giving them advice on making their system look more like ours. Wow.
Honestly, I'm amongst the people who some years ago I never realized that USA is facing a number of economic challenges, because I was in that mentality that, oh, USA, is a superpower, and at no point it is facing these challenges. And the first thing that the professor talked about, that I would also like to do a commentary on, or talk about it, relating to things which are happening in Africa also, because Africa is envisioned as one of the countries which will be rising, specifically which belongs to the BRICS, that is the South Africa, as seen to be rising in the near coming future, because as predicted, USA right now is falling. And as you've watched the video, you've seen how specifically he highlights the issues, talking about the tariffs which are being put to Chinese goods, the sanctions which are being done to the Chinese products, because to eliminate the competition. And when eliminating the competition, that really shows that this person is afraid of what is yet to happen to them. Amongst other things is debt levels. Trust me, I didn't know that USA has big debt levels. And as much as we Africans back here in the motherland, we are still grappling with high debt levels, which we still owe the Chinese, specifically Kenya. And we have trillions of money which we still owe Kenya. And just recently seeing Biden and our president, William Samoei Ruto, trying to discuss about their future economic activities. This really shows a number of things, which also the video I've talked about. I mean, if you just try to look at it keenly, you'll realize this. You know, the debts which you say have are continuing to grow rapidly. And trust me when I say this, I didn't know that USA is having this much of debt. And I came to realize that we have some people, especially people who are in their 50s right now. If you ask them the prices of the product, they tell you that the prices of the product has risen 10 times than it was before. While in Africa, we can say that there's a significant increase in prices of goods and services, which leads to inflation, if you can say. But if you look at the rates, while we Africans are still navigating these challenges, in the USA, the impact is 10 times. So you can see how it's still affecting these people. So my only advice to this is diasporans can take advantage of coming to Africa and economically try to thrive back here in Africa. I also like to talk about the trade deficits that USA is still having. USA has trade deficits, especially owing the Chinese huge percentage of trade deficits. This means that the imports are more than the exports that they have, which can be a sign of economic imbalance. Now look, Africans learning from mistakes that USA as a superpower has done is relying more on imports than exports, because when you have imports more than exports, you have something called the imported inflation, and you really know that. So as Africans, we really know that we are endowed with these natural resources. We have the minerals and we have all this. So if we bank on producing our own resources, invest so much in technology, we'll find a way of beating this. And my call for diasporans is come and tap on Africa's resources. Come and tap on Africa's resources, because this will make you big. This will make you thrive, because we will not be relying on imports more than exports. Because here in Africa, if we have more exports than imports, trust me, you're already doing better. And that's a way of just beating US. And I feel like the world is afraid that Africa will rise, and we are still utilizing our resources. That's why we are stopping the colonizers to leave our resources alone, so that we can have ways of increasing our exports, to increase our incomes and general growth which Africans has. And that really shows, that's an indicator of growth of any country, specifically African countries. Talking about South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, um, Nigeria, those are countries which has a lot of potential. Just to say the giant one, which is Congo, when it comes to resources, So those are the things that we need to discuss, talking about the future perspectives of Africa. Also, another thing that the USA is grappling with, another challenge, is there's a decline in manufacturing sector. You see, um, there's declines in jobs, especially. Just ask around, or if you're a person who from the United States, you're watching this video, you can realize that there is a decline in the manufacturing sector in the USA. And I'm not trying to say that it is a good thing that it is declining. No, it's not a good thing, but this is just the reality. Whereas in Africa, manufacturing industry, it's the opposite. We keep on having new ways, new technological ways of coming up with things to try to manufacture our own goods and services. And you've been seeing us trying to thrive so well. So again, this is a wake-up call to the diasporans to, try to think about it and see if there is something you can come here in the motherland and try tap into it. When the professor says that the problem of capitalism, I don't think this is just capitalism. This is something way more than capitalism. For me, I would like to call it fascism. This is something which is more than capitalism. Because talk about corporations and people who control economic sectors, people who have been given loans and people who borrow and lend USA, you'll come to understand this is not even just about capitalism, but it's more of fascism. Because the income inequality which is in the USA is so big. Look at the big margin between people who have and people who don't have. People who have still, the funny thing is that, and he highlighted this, the funny thing is that people who have, or people who are economically endowed in the USA, they keep on getting resources in ways that he explained. One which he explains with was when he said that people with money, they are not taxed, so that they can get a lot of resources that they could lend back to the government. Talking about the corporates, This shows you that there is really a big problem here, because this will this will keep on creating these huge disparities. Come back to the motherland, Africa. Look at it deeply. As much as we're still having this gap in Africa, but it's not to that extent. You see, in the USA, the extent is quadrupled. It's even 10 times. The effect is 10 times, even more than what's happening here in Africa. So with the resources, we can try bridge this gap and narrow down these disparities that we're having between the rich and the poor. Also, I'd like to say that there is a shift in global power. And remember, I said that the USA is declining. The West generally is declining. Europe itself is declining. When China knows how to play its games very well, creating that good rapport with Africa, creating strong economic opportunities for Africans, the USA makes things look like it's business, and the exploitation that the West has been having. So the global shift in power, because I believe when World War II ended, that's around 1945. Yes, when World War II ended, USA emerged as a world power, and we know that. But there's a shift in power today, and as you can see, China is getting to enlarge or to expand its influence here in Africa. And this means that every African country will turn to China, because even the USA itself owes China some debt. I always thought that it is only Africa, for instance, specifically Kenya, that we owe China a lot of those debts. But even in the USA, they own China huge amount of debts. So this shows that there is a big shift in power. Number two, in which in the way in which there is a shift in power is the Africans are getting to rise, getting to know their rights, and getting to know how to utilize their resources. And you can imagine how there'll be a shift in power when now African government will say that we're not taking any resources out of Africa. We are going to utilize these resources here in Africa and make the African great, expand our educational sector, expand our technological sector, and different sectors which we can use these resources to make Africa rise. And you know, when I'm saying that, it's really, really serious, you know. A lot of African countries are withdrawing from USA, the international agreements that they have. That really shows you there is a shift in power. When Africans are withdrawing contracts, I mean, it's so funny that I'm just seeing our country, Kenya, still in, you know, international agreements, making those agreements with the USA, or, you know, I also like to like that there is a technological competition. As the professor said, economic professor said, he said that China offers the same, okay, not same, but high quality product with the lower price. And this shows, or this gives a challenge to the USA, because their prices are high and it is not so much technologically advanced as that from China. That really shows you how China is, not China, but USA is yet to fall, and generally the West is yet to fall. And I would like to ask you a question. Just tell me what you think about this in the comment section. As you know, this is your presenter, Eugene Jockey Stories. Until then, let's meet in my next video. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're watching for this for the first time. You can join my membership, get to know what I can offer you. In the meantime, let's meet on the other side. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.